Start, I want to say a couple of things. First, let me ask, how many in the audience are actual farmers? And how many are multi-generational farmers? So the reason I ask, I'm not taking names or anything. For many years, it was very hard to find someone in Sullivan County who didn't have some connection to farming. Perhaps they were not themselves a farmer, but chances are in a generation or two removed, there was a farm in the family somewhere. So that was pretty interesting. Let me start with a bit of a disclaimer. And I do this all the time when I do programs about the hotels, which obviously I do a lot more often than farming. But I'm not going to be talking tonight about individual farms. That's not what I do, and it's probably a fool's errand to try to do that, because inevitably you leave someone out, and then you have a problem. So I'm not mentioning family farms. It's really a much more general discussion about farming and the influence that it had on our history overall. And if you think about it, Sullivan County is known worldwide for two things primarily. One, the resort industry that really dominated our economy for decades here, maybe centuries. And two, the Woodstock Festival. Those are the things that people all over the world know Sullivan County for. Both of those have a link to farming. We're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So farming has been in the background, but it's there, and it's been a constant. You're probably aware that James Earl Jones passed away, and it's impossible to go on Facebook without seeing the clip, the great speech that he gives in the movie Field of Dreams, where he talks about baseball being the constant. America marches on, but baseball's been the constant. Well, that's sort of the role that farming plays in Sullivan County's history, and that's what we're trying to look at tonight. So if you're disappointed that I didn't talk about the legacy of your family's farms, probably very deserving, but that's not what we're going to do tonight. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. So farms, farmers, and farming in Sullivan County. Though it never achieved the status of timber tanning or tourism, or even bluestone quarrying for that matter, farming has always been an important industry in Sullivan County. And let me clarify that statement. When I say the status, I'm talking about not that it didn't make the economic impact that these other industries did, because it probably throughout our history has often been our largest or second or third largest industry. But in terms of status, in terms of what people think about when they think of Sullivan County, farming is not usually at the top. As I said, the hotels are typically number one, and yet farming has always been there, and farming has influenced many of these other industries. So it's been a critical part of our history, and that's what we're going to explore tonight. When the first European settlement was established in the area of what is today Sullivan County, that settlement known as Coshocton, it was established by a group from eastern Connecticut who wanted to own their own farmland. That's what brought them here. And farmland in eastern Connecticut was becoming very difficult to obtain. The area was becoming overpopulated. All the farmland was spoken for. And so these folks began to form little companies, and they actually petitioned the colonial governor to move west. Because when they came here to the Delaware River, and when some of their neighbors went to the Susquehanna River in northeastern Pennsylvania, they believed they were still in Connecticut. Connecticut claimed all of this land, well into the west. Some of you may be aware that there's a section of Ohio to this day known as the Western Reserve. How many of you heard of the Western Reserve? The Western Reserve was settled by and claimed by Connecticut. Connecticut and Pennsylvania actually end up fighting 3 wars over who owns the land in northeastern Pennsylvania. They're called the Pennamite-Yankee Wars. Chances are you've never heard of the Pennamite-Yankee Wars. You can look them up. But at any rate, it was farming that brought these folks here. And when they came, they claimed what is probably the only good farmland in all of what is today Sullivan County. And that's the land that at that time was along the Delaware River. There was very rich soil there, and they were able to grow things, which, as you'll see, became problematic as we began to move away from the river. But at any rate, when they came here, these farmers from eastern Connecticut, they discovered that they were not the first farmers. Again, their farmland was along the river, and both sides of the Delaware, both the New York and Pennsylvania sides, and that was the Cushatunk settlement, which was basically about 30 miles long. So if you wanted to put it in today's terms, probably from Lackawaxen, present-day Lackawaxen, Pennsylvania, or Minisink Ford, New York, if you know where that is, to about Callicoon, about 30 miles. 8 or 10 miles deep on either side of the river, that's what they considered Cushatunk. And Cushatunk is just the English version of a Native American word for this region of the upper Delaware. And by the way, I'll just, as an aside, and I'm kind of going adrift here for a moment, when those eastern Connecticut farmers come here, they do not displace Native Americans. The Native Americans had left this area decades before. There were a few stragglers still in the area, and these farmers literally purchased the land from them. We have the contract of sale. And I'll let you in on a little secret. This is an aside, not really related to farming directly. But if you look at that contract of sale, we have some Native Americans who made their mark on the one side, and then a group of Connecticut settlers on the other side. And among those Connecticut settlers is a very interesting name, which I'm shocked no one has ever mentioned before. I don't know if no one noticed it, if no one paid attention, but we're in the process of digging into the story and developing a narrative around this. The name, one of the signatories on the Connecticut side is Benedict Arnold Jr. Assuming most of you know who Benedict Arnold is. So we know it's not the general, but at this point in time we're about 99% sure that it's his father. And if you know the story of the general and his betrayal of his country during the Revolutionary War, you probably know that his father played a major role in that, in a way. His father had been a wealthy businessman, very successful. In fact, the general's great-grandfather was governor of Rhode Island. So it was a very successful, prominent family. And his father was carrying on that tradition. But while Benedict Arnold was away at school, he went to boarding school, and the idea was he'd go to Yale, and he would grow up in a very prominent part of a very prominent family. But while he's away at school, 2 of his siblings die from yellow fever. And his father takes it very hard. And he begins what in those days they called a dissipative lifestyle. Today we would say he became a drunkard. And he squanders the family fortune. His wife dies shortly thereafter, and so Benedict Arnold has to be taken out of school. Instead of growing up and going to Yale and having all the advantages of a wealthy family, he has to be apprenticed out. He apprentices at an apothecary, learns a trade. Point is, he grows up with a chip on his shoulder. He hates that his father has cheated him out of his inheritance, and every time there's a setback in his life, he takes it very personally. If his pay is late, as a military man during the Revolutionary War, everybody's pay was always late, but he takes it as a personal affront. If he passed over for a promotion, he takes it as a personal affront. And so when the British approach him about betraying his country, he's much more receptive to their overtures, especially when they offered him money. At any rate, it's a story that we're working on now, but just as an aside. Benedict Arnold. Pretty interesting, right? His ties to Sullivan County. So the Cushitunk settlers are among our earliest farmers, but not our first. For that, we have to go back to the Native Americans, the Lenape, or as most historians refer to them today, the Munsee. And just to clarify that situation, so for many years, historians looked at the Lenape. By the way, the British would call them the Delaware, so you may hear that term. But historians would look at the Lenape as being made up of three separate groups, or three separate tribes. The Munsee, which were the mountain people, they were the folks who were this far upriver. The Unami, which were the river people, they were in the Delaware Water Gap area of Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And the Unalaklego, which were the ocean people down in the Long Island area and so on. Historians have abandoned that theory now, and the accepted history is that there were two groups of Lenape with separate dialects and somewhat separate cultures, the Unami and the Munsee. So there's no more Unalaklego. But the Munsee were the Lenape group that was here, and they only spent the warm weather months here, and typically along the Delaware River. Somewhat along the Neversink as well, and maybe in the Mamakating Valley, but not much in the interior of Sullivan County. This was heavily forested. They came here to hunt and to fish, but in terms of any living that they did, it was along the rivers. And they were the first farmers. And it's interesting to note that for thousands of years, the Lenape were hunters and gatherers. When they learned horticulture, when they learned to actually grow crops, that changes their entire culture. And this is the impact that farming has on the human race throughout history. Once you learn to grow crops, to plant and to nourish and to harvest, you are able to create communities. When you're a hunter-gatherer, you have to go where the game is. So you're very nomadic. It's impossible to put down roots. So farming is what enables a culture to establish a permanent place, to establish a sense of place. That's the role that farming plays in human nature. And the Lenape were no different. They were very nomadic when they were hunters and gatherers. Once they learned to plant crops, they're able to put down roots, so to speak. And in the Lenape culture, the women did most of the farming. The men would do the harvesting, which was a little bit more arduous, but the women were, for the most part, the ones who oversaw the farming. And where there was interaction between the Europeans and the Lenape, which primarily took place downriver, down on the lower part of the Delaware River. To some extent here, but not too much, because as I said, for the most part, the Lenape had left. There was an exchange of ideas. And this exchange of ideas is primarily why those settlers were able to survive here. And the Lenape taught them a few different things. The Native American Lenape tribe, which spent the warm weather months here for thousands of years before the Europeans arrived, and in many ways the Lenape were our first snowbirds. No one wanted to spend the winters here, even back then. And so they would move south when the cold weather came. They depended upon farming for their survival. Women did most of the farming, though the arduous task of harvesting was often left to the men. The Lenape grew mostly corn, beans, and squash, which are often referred to as the three sisters of Native American agriculture. And this is something that the European settlers learned from them. And in exchange, the Europeans also gave the Lenape ideas help them, but corn, beans, and squash. So who knows the story, why corn, beans, and squash? And this is kind of an almost magical combination of crops. It wasn't just an arbitrary grouping. So check this out. Beans grow on a pole. They need a pole to grow. So if you plant corn and you enable the corn to get a little bit of a start, that provides the pole for the beans. The beans can grow on the stalk. Okay? In turn, the beans take nitrogen from the air and deposit it in the soil, which enables the corn to grow taller, faster, better, which gives the beans more of a pole to grow, so they help each other. That's why they plant them together. And why squash? Because,
it's like a mulch.
what's that?
It's like a mulch.
Well, the squash leaves provided shade for the seeds. They also tended to be large and somewhat spiky to keep predators away from eating the seeds, and therefore help the other two grow. So we see the three of them working in synergy. And once the Europeans learned the concept of the three sisters from the Native Americans, it enabled them to survive here where they probably would not have been able to survive elsewhere, or otherwise, I should say. Many European settlers here farmed for survival as well. Even as the county's economy was being fueled by the burgeoning timber and tanning industries, by 1855 there were 125,000 acres of farmland under cultivation in Sullivan County. In 1880, records show there were 4,394 farms in the county, with the average farm comprising 107 acres. So I don't know if you can do that math in your head, but that's 475,000 acres of land under cultivation, roughly. That's a lot of land. But that waxes and wanes. So by 1890, the number of farms had decreased to 4,096, but the average size of the farm had increased to roughly 112 acres. In 1900, there were 3,887 farms, averaging 123.2 acres. So think about that. As late as 1900, there were still nearly 4,000 working farms in Sullivan County. And by 1940, there were just 2,778 farms, averaging 91.5 acres each. So in the 40 years between 1900 and 1940, we lose over 1,000 farms. And they are getting smaller, the farms that survive. So what does that tell you? What can you discern from that fact? Well, the land is becoming more valuable for other purposes than for farming. You can make more money devoting that land to some other purpose. And what happens between 1900 and 1940? We see a lot of the resorts growing, and many of the resorts that had started out as working farms begin to abandon the farm operation and devote their energies simply to entertaining guests. This is from 1856, and you can see this is just a table of the yield of the farms in Sullivan County. You can see what's being grown here. First of all, improved acres, 34,000, unimproved acres, 141,000. The cash value of the farms, $3.5 million. And what was being grown? Wheat, rye, corn, oats, potatoes. The potatoes were not among the earliest crops grown here. They came along much later. So what brought the potatoes here?
The Irish.
The Cushitung settlers did not grow potatoes. I didn't hear what did you say?
I said the Irish.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. So when do we see the Irish immigration into America?
The famine.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's two waves of Irish immigration into Sullivan County. The first wave, which is the smaller of the two waves, comes with the construction of the D&H Canal. So between 1825 and 1828, we have literally thousands of laborers building the canal. Much of it is in Sullivan County. And a number of them stay. And they're almost all Irish. The canal's built largely with Irish laborers. And then the second wave comes with the famine, the 1840s, early 1850s. And by the way, many of those Irish come here and work in the tanneries. And this is a common story, and I can speak from my own family. Two of my great-grandfathers came over in 1850, went to work in the tanneries, the Stevens Brothers Tannery in what is today Swan Lake, eventually the Gilman Tannery in Forestburg. They saved their money and they purchased farms. So both of those great-grandfathers, and this is, I'm not telling that because it's a personal story, I'm telling that because it's very illustrative of what happened. Many of these Irish laborers in the tanneries end up buying farms. This is sort of a typical story. Now, not all of them. There were many that can, what happens typically with the tanners learned early on that when you deplete the hemlock population in an area, because no one ever thought about growing more hemlocks. So when you deplete the hemlock population, it's much cheaper to abandon the tannery there and to move on to a place where there are more hemlocks than it is to try to transport hemlocks to the tannery. So that's why hemlock tanning moves from the Berkshires to Greene County, from Greene County to Ulster County, from Ulster County to Sullivan County. And when we've depleted the hemlocks in the 1880s, it continues to move westward into Pennsylvania and beyond. And many of the Irish laborers moved with it. Not all of them saved up their money and bought farms, but that was a common practice. So you can see the things that were grown here. You can also see the animals that were part of the farming industry. I thought this was a very interesting table from 1856.
Sheep.
More sheep than cows.
Yeah, at that point in time there were. Cows were much more expensive. There was very little to do with the cows. I mean, there was no market for milk locally in 1856. So why did farming begin to decline? Because once you got away from that rich soil along the Delaware River, the old-timers who came here found out the hard way. How do you tell when you get to Sullivan County? There are 2 stones for every dirt. It's a pretty rocky place, pretty hard to grow things. And even when you had soil that wasn't particularly rocky, it was soil that lacked some important nutrients for farming, like nitrogen, for example. It was just not a great place to grow things. And that's why we're going to see farmers who came here often looked to do other things, and there were no prosperous farms. If you wanted to make a living farming, the best way to do it was to peddle your goods around. So instead of truck farms and things that we think of when we think of farms, the early farms might peddle some produce locally. Once we begin to see a resort industry, you have a bit of a market there. But there were no farms that were supporting themselves by shipping out produce. We just couldn't grow enough to do that. It was all about local markets. From the late decades of the 19th century through the middle of the 20th century, a sizable portion of land was settled by new immigrants of ethnic backgrounds who wanted to pursue farming as a livelihood, or at least they thought they did. Some purchased farms already in existence, while others pursued land that was otherwise untested for agricultural purposes. Many members of the latter group found out soon that neither their land nor their climate were compatible with sustainable methods of commercial farming, and they sought other means to supplement their income. That statement was actually taken from the script for a documentary that was planned. I don't think it was ever made. I don't think it ever got produced, but this was a documentary that was planned back in 2011. And that's very true. Primarily what we see happen is that as the Jewish immigration into New York City increased in the last half of the 19th century, many of these Jewish immigrants in the city are living in squalor, and they can't escape that. No matter how hard they work, they could have several members of the family working all day, every day, and they still can't escape that poverty that plagues them in the city. And many of them end up getting sick. This is the story of New York City. As the population explodes, they can't keep up with it in terms of sanitation. And the sanitary facilities are just not up to this increase in population, this population explosion. And so more and more people are getting sick. And many of them seek relief in the mountains because the railroad has learned to promote the mountains as a healing environment. Many of you have seen the advertisements I've done, shown in other talks. Doctors say go to the mountains. And many of these Jewish immigrants took that to heart, and they ride the railroad up to Sullivan County. The perfect story, the perfect example of the story is the Grossinger family. So Selig Grossinger and his family are living on the Lower East Side. They're all working hard. They can't escape poverty. Selig gets sick. Doctors say go to the mountains. They scrape together $450. They buy an old farm in Ferndale. This is the farmhouse. And they come up to farm. He was a farmer in Europe, so he figures he'll farm. He can make a living up here. He didn't bother to ask any of the old timers, how do you tell when you get to Sullivan County? So that first summer of 1914 that the Grossinger family is operating what they called the Longbrook Farm, they take in 9 boarders. They gross $81. But that's a windfall for them. And they have a family meeting and they decide that's the future, not trying to farm in this rocky soil. And it just happens that Malka Grossinger had come from an innkeeping family in Europe. And so they abandon the farming and they concentrate on taking in boarders. And what comes out of that? One of the most famous hotels in the world, eventually. So from 1914, this ramshackle farmhouse, by 1919, they've outgrown this and the addition they put on and the property that they bought next door, and they buy the Nichols estate on the top of the hill where we all remember Grossinger's being. So the story begins with farming. And by no means is it the only story. This is a typical farmhouse turned boarding house. Many farms, many of those nearly 4,000 farms that we saw were in existence in 1900 were taking in boarders to make ends meet. Thousands of farmhouses were taking in boarders. And during the latter part of the 19th century, so let's say certainly from 1890 to at least 1915, we have thousands of farmhouses making up much of the accommodations here that are part of our Silver Age, where tourism was our primary industry, driven by the railroad, but mainly supported by the farms. It's farming that makes that Silver Age possible. And this is a typical farmhouse. And what would typically happen, and I have a slide in another presentation that I often show of a hotel called Brophy's Mountain View in Hurleyville. And you can see the farmhouse clearly delineated in the center, and then the additions that were put on as the boarding operation grows. And that's typically what happens to these farmhouses. There are additions put on as more and more people come. And then as we get into the 20th century, we see an interesting phenomenon happen. And again, I speak from experience. This is a picture of my great-grandfather's farm, the farmhouse. And this is in Kiamisha. And he dies in 1906. And when he dies, the farming operation is sort of abandoned. And they turn to their full attention to taking in boarders. And it becomes a boarding house in Kiamisha. And this, again, is a very typical story. This is how many farmers end up. And then in the early part of the 20th century, another interesting phenomenon takes place. So our Silver Age collapses. And if you've heard me speak before, you probably know the reason why. Silver Age collapses probably for hundreds of reasons, but primarily because of the change in the way the medical profession views tuberculosis. Okay? Tuberculosis had been a plague on the human population for centuries, millennium, really. And doctors had no idea what caused it, let alone how to treat it. But for most of that time, the consensus among medical doctors was that tuberculosis was not contagious. It was not a communicable disease. Most doctors believed it was hereditary because it often ran in families. And it wasn't until the early part of the 20th century that begins to change. So in the 1880s, in Germany, a doctor named Koch isolates the tubercle bacillus. And that's the first time anyone realized, well, this is what causes tuberculosis, this bacteria. And once the germ theory of disease begins to gain some momentum, more and more doctors are beginning to believe that, oh yes, you can catch tuberculosis. By the way, not just from coughing and spitting of an infected human, but there's another principal way of catching tuberculosis that has to do with farming. Who knows what that is? Cows contracted tuberculosis. Bovine tuberculosis was very common. And tuberculosis spread through the milk. And so certifying your herd as being free of tuberculosis was critical to surviving as a dairy farm. But once the medical profession begins to agree that tuberculosis is contagious, as we get into the early years of the 19th century, or the 20th century, now people who are riding the train coming to the mountains, who for years didn't care if they were sitting next to someone who was coughing and spitting, because you can't catch tuberculosis, right? Now suddenly they don't want any part of that. They don't want their kids on the train with tuberculosis patients, and so they stop coming to the mountains if they're healthy. And our Silver Age collapses. So what happens? That coincides with what I was talking about before. These Jewish immigrants in the city, working hard, getting sick, looking to escape. Look at all this cheap land that's now for sale. Because the farms and the boarding houses are struggling because people have stopped coming. And so what we see happening is that a lot of these farms change ownership. A lot of these hotels change ownership. Where before, throughout most of our Silver Age, resorts are 100% Gentile owned and operated, entertaining 100% Gentile guests. We begin to see that change. Beginning in 1899, but then in earnest as we get into the early 1900s, and especially between 1910 and 1920. It's a massive change. And many of the resorts in the 19th century, as I said, had been working farms. But as they change hands, we see more and more of them abandoning the farming operation. So by 1940, certainly between 1940 and the end of World War II, almost all, not all, but almost all of the resorts that had been working farms, they abandoned the farming operation. This is a perfect example. This is Columbia Farms. And by the way, they'll also abandon the name. Some of you may know that for a few years I owned and operated a hotel very much like this called Eddy Farm. And Eddy Farm had been a working farm up until 1940. They abandoned the dairy operation in 1940, about the same time that the Columbia Farm abandoned it. Now, Eddy Farm never changed its name. They continued to be known as Eddy Farm, but the Columbia drops the farm part of the name. And most of the hotels that had farm in their name dropped that as we get into the 20th century, certainly the middle part of the 20th century. But farming is what created many of these resorts. And when the railroad arrives in the 1870s, that changes everything. Because for the first time, now you have a market for goods. But again, we're not able to grow anything here to take advantage of that. For the most part, there were some exceptions, like cauliflower and things. We were able to ship out some goods. But for the most part, what we're able to ship out is milk. Because suddenly we have the New York City market, and the railroad can get the milk there. Now remember, back at that time, the milk industry is very different because there's two important things lacking: pasteurization and refrigeration. So milk spoils very quickly. So getting it to market immediately was important, and the railroad provided that means. So when the O&W Railroad began operating regular milk trains from the county to the New York metropolitan area in 1879, a typical trip consisted of 27 stops in Sullivan, and the shipment averaged 250 of the standard 40-quart cans of milk. So not a lot of milk going out of here in 1879. Why? Because prior to the railroad, how many farmers could afford a herd of dairy cows? Not very many. You probably had dairy cows just to provide yourself with milk and probably a little extra to sell locally. But there was no market beyond that, and cows were expensive. But the railroad changes that. So the Sullivan County Milk Association is formed in 1880, and there were an estimated 2,500 dairy cows producing in the county. And by the following year, production had increased to 17,430 cans per week, in addition to 165 cans of condensed milk and 311 cans of cream. By 1901, the county was shipping 9 million cans of milk on the railroad annually. So look at the growth just in 20 years. Why? Because the railroad opened up that market. And we begin to see farms that before had dabbled in dairy now become full-fledged dairy farms. And they would have milk houses of one sort or another. Common sites throughout Sullivan County. And creameries begin to crop up. And in many cases, the railroad would offer to help fund creameries, to finance them. And the creameries would take fluid milk and produce value-added products, cream, butter, etc. So this is the Hurleyville Creamery. Creameries are all over, and eventually many of them are co-ops. And the Dairymen's League finances some of them. And they had a spotty record. A lot of the creameries were not successful. Milk prices began to be manipulated. They were tightly controlled, and it was very hard to make a living with your dairy farm. Who knows where this dairy farm was located? Anybody recognize that? That's the inside of it. Well, you probably wouldn't.
It's Brussels, right?
No, this is actually the dairy farm at the Loomis Sanitarium. And that was one of the things that set the Loomis Sanitarium apart from many other places that treated tuberculosis in America. They had a certified herd. They provided their own milk. They were able to produce their own milk. And for many years, a good part of this barn, I can't do the laser on the TV, but the back part, the left-hand side of this, stood right up until about 15 years ago when the town of Liberty tore it down to build their new highway barn. They utilized it as their highway barn. This is the inside of it. And if you walked through the highway barn, a portion of it, in 2004, you would have seen those structures there where the cows are. And of course, farms were so ubiquitous throughout the county that scenes like this on every street in every community were pretty common back then, because the farms needed hay, the cattle had to be fed, and most of the farms could not produce enough for their own use, so they would buy hay from other farms. Dairy farming remained big business in the county as long as the railroad operated. The railroad was the key, getting the milk out of the county. For example, in 1940, there were 26,271 cattle in the county over the age of 3 months. Most of these were dairy breeds, with Holstein Friesian the most popular, followed by Ayrshire and Guernsey. During the preceding year, there were 9 million gallons of milk produced in the county, of which 7,569,000 gallons were sold as fluid milk, generating $1,286,000 for farmers. Now, you could probably do the math and figure out how much they were getting for a gallon, but it's not very much. And that's why it was very hard to survive simply, even with the railroad, very hard to survive on dairy farming alone. And that's why many of these farms look to other ways of making money. When the railroad decided in May of 1879 that it needed to raise the price for shipping a standard 40-quart milk can from 40 cents to 50 cents, farmers banded together to protest the increase. Prominent dairy farmers in the county called a meeting at the Liberty House, and proving that there is strength in numbers, they were able to trim the higher rate to 45 cents per can. So they threatened to withhold their milk. And the railroad was making so much money shipping the milk, they didn't want to lose that business. And so they compromised. So instead of raising the rate to 50 cents per can, they raised it just to 45. And that's when the Sullivan County Milk Association is formed. And when that was formed in 1880, there were about 2,500 dairy cows producing in the county, including 4. Now this is just a breakdown of which station had the most dairy cows. So in 1880, there were very few cows, not even enough in Hurleyville to be listed. But within a few years, that would all change. So this is kind of the beginning of the dairy industry in Sullivan County. You can see where the bulk of the farms were. And this again is from that documentary that was never made. A slow but steady erosion of dairy farms has been occurring since the mid-1950s. So this is written in 2011. Fueled by 2 federally sponsored buyout programs and several years of low milk prices, the exodus of dairy operations grew larger during the late 1980s and into the 90s, going from 164 dairies in 1982 to 80 in 1993 and down to 50 by 1999. This trend slowed in the early 2000s, but began to accelerate by 2005 as increased age of operator, spiraling land prices, taxes, and competition for land, that should say competition, I'm not sure how that turned into completion, from developers put additional stresses on the dairy industry. 39 dairies remained in 2005, when another round of low prices and escalating input further reduced numbers, going to 37 in 2007, 30 in 2008, and the present number of 26 in 2011. So I think that's probably the low point. We begin thereafter to see a little bit of an increase as some youngsters come to the county and think that farming is a good idea again. I'm not sure what the present number is. But you can see that this is just a tremendous decrease in the number of dairy farms. 26 farms, where before we had thousands. Of course, dairy farms were not the only farms that thrived in Sullivan County for a time.
Chicken.
Poultry farming was pretty important here for many, many years. And in fact, we were known as the egg basket of New York State. And at one point in time, we were shipping eggs to Russia, to many countries in Europe and Asia. We were producing literally millions of dozens of eggs a year. We'll see some of those numbers coming up. Chicken farms were important, particularly toward the middle of the 20th century. During 1939, for instance, $925,000 worth of poultry and poultry products were sold by Sullivan County farms. There were 742,000 chickens raised in the county, of which 422,000 were sold alive or dressed. In addition, 3,169,942 dozen eggs were produced in Sullivan County. So roughly 36 million eggs, probably more than that. White leghorns were the most popular birds. New Hampshire red and Plymouth Rock were also kept. So this is the impact of poultry farming on the county just prior to World War II. This is an interesting photo I thought I would throw in here.
An egg candler.
Yeah, she's actually candling. So what do you think that was about? Why did they candle the eggs? I know a lot of you know this.
The blood in the
Well,
How many
eggs.
of you have ever done that? Have you ever
I
candled?
did it.
So what was the idea?
The blood in the egg.
Yeah, see if there was blood. But there's another interesting phenomenon that takes place because of the egg industry here. So if you are in the egg business, obviously you have to depend upon
Sex.
chicks being born, right? But male chicks do you no good. And the interesting thing about chicks, and I'm not a farmer, so you probably know a lot more about this than I do. But the interesting thing about chicks, I've discovered through research, not through any hands-on experience, that you cannot, the average person cannot tell the difference between a male and a female chick until they're a few months old, because physically there is no difference. So if you have a huge poultry operation, think of the cost of keeping those male chicks alive until you're sure they're not going to be able to produce eggs for you. That's an investment that you really don't want to make. So being able to discern the sex of the chicken as early as possible is very important to a large poultry operation. If you have a small farm, it probably doesn't matter. But if you're farming on a huge scale, it's important. So having a sexer, being able to determine that as early as possible becomes critical to your survival. It's a little known fact that the world's best chicken sexers come almost exclusively from Japan. Now this is in the 1950s, by the way, this quote. Poultry owners once had to wait until chicks were 5 to 6 weeks old before differentiating male from female. The sex became visible when adult feathers started appearing, on the basis of which cockerels and pullets could easily be distinguished. But for commercial egg producers, it's important to identify the females as soon as possible to avoid unnecessary feeding of unproductive male chicks. Enter the Zen Nippon Chick Sexing School, which began 2-year courses training people to accurately discriminate the sex of day-old chicks on the basis of very subtle clues. Graduates of the Nippon Zen School could identify the sex of hundreds of chicks per hour with 97% accuracy. No one seemed to understand how they did it. But what I discovered in almost by accident, and what caused me to do this research, was a conversation with a young guy who had gone to school with my wife, graduated Liberty High School. I was talking to him at one of her class reunions, and I said, you know, how did your family end up coming to Sullivan County? He said, I'm not sure if it was his father or his grandfather, was a chicken sexer. And he said there were other families that came here. So some of our earliest Asian immigrants into Sullivan County came here because they were chicken sexers. There weren't a lot of them because, again, the small poultry farms, they couldn't afford to employ someone. It didn't make that much difference to them. But if you had a huge operation, we had several farms here that were huge, it was important to know. So they employed these Asian folks. I'm not sure if his ancestors had gone to the Zen Nippon school, but they were chicken sexers. Yes.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
In your research, did you learn why poultry became such a big industry? Because it's kind of strange that to happen here, since we actually don't grow a lot of corn. I would assume that, you know, most of the grains for the chicken would have had to been imported. So why would we have had such a big?
I think it was just easy to do. I think chickens were easy to raise, and they didn't require lush farmland like growing
So
crops.
the grain was all
They were
imported
cheap.
by train.
No, I think you could grow corn here. I think they grew the corn here. A lot of it wasn't necessarily great eating corn, but it was good for feeding the chicks. What we saw in many of the cases, we see the creation of co-ops all throughout the Fallsburg area. The chicken farms were part of the co-ops there, and so the feed and everything came out of the co-op. So you had reduced prices for feed from some of the other farms that were growing. You didn't necessarily have to grow your own feed. But I think probably the answer to your question is it was simple to do. It was easy, and it didn't require a huge investment like cows. It was much cheaper to start raising chickens than raising dairy cows. That's my theory. I don't know, maybe other reasons. Yes, and
I think people wanted to eat food that didn't have so much fat, something changed in the diet, and being more conscious of lean products. And chickens are ready to eat in 8 weeks.
well, of course, yeah, and there were lots of factors like that factor into, the chicken in every pot idea. Yes, sir.
I heard somewhere that there was a New Deal, in the New Deal, there was subsidy of chicken farming.
That could be too. And don't forget, the Jewish Agricultural Society was also providing financing for some of these farms too. So they may have known what was tried and true. As I said, there probably a lot of factors went into it. There have been other animals raised commercially in Sullivan County over the years, including sheep, horses, and even chinchillas. The scope of these operations varied greatly over the years, as evidenced by the fact that in 1845 there were nearly 20,000 sheep in the county. Remember that chart that we saw earlier from 1856? But by 1940 that number had declined to 507. So this again is that waxing and waning. Farming has taken on many different appearances over the years. And one of the things that I also didn't delve into, and I've done a separate program on the apple industry here. But again, if you think of apples as part of farming, which technically it is, we had a huge commercial apple industry here for a number of years, but no longer. So, for many years this was a common sight in Sullivan County. We don't see this much anymore. But we do see, I think, more young people entering into the farming profession, and of course modern farming techniques have made it a little bit more realistic to try to farm here. So we're seeing the rise again, I think, of farms. I don't think it's ever going to approach the scale that it once did, but we are seeing a little bit of an increase. And of course, a lot of the farmers are able to support or to add to their support by the local farm markets, which are becoming popular throughout. It's just one of them. Just happen to have that one handy. So I think we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence in farming. I remember, on a personal note, when I was in high school, calling someone a farmer, that was like a very derogatory term. But I don't think that's the case anymore. At some point in time, we began to look upon farming with a little bit different gaze. And farmers became recognized as the lifeblood of our civilization. And folks like Wendell Berry brought about a new regard for farming. And this is just in my lifetime that I've seen that change. And hopefully that will continue, because, it's trite to say, but without farming, where would we be, right? We don't have food to eat if you don't grow the food. Like the old joke, you can't get the food from the grocery store, right? You don't. Why kill animals when you can get the meat in the grocery store? So at any rate, that's my presentation on farming.